Assalamu alaikum, everybody, to another episode of Palestine in Session. My name is Tariq Khalil. I am Education Coordinator for the American Muslims for Palestine. And in honor of Black History Month, this session is titled Black-Palestinian Transnational Solidarity, a movement for freedom and liberation. And we have an awesome panel today. But before I introduce the panel, I want to take this time and pay tribute to the most recent Palestinian martyrs killed by Israeli occupation forces on February 22nd in Nablus in the occupied West Bank. Israel killed 10 Palestinians and injured 100 more. Also in Hawara in Nablus on Sunday, just a couple of days ago. Over 100 armed Israeli settlers accompanied by a dozen Israeli occupation forces invaded the town and set dozens of Palestinian homes and cars on fire. A 37-year-old man was shot and killed by Israeli fire. 2 others were shot and wounded. A third was stabbed, and a fourth was beaten with an iron bar. Some 95 others are still being treated for tear gas inhalation. 144 Palestinians were killed in 2022, making it the highest number of Palestinians killed in the West Bank by Israeli occupation forces since the Second Intifada in 2000. Settler vigilantism and violence, aided and abetted by the IOF, is a continual occurrence, not some aberrational event. Same also in the United States. Police brutality is not an aberration. Law enforcement in the US killed at least 1,176 people in 2022, making it the deadliest year on record for police violence since 2013. Black people represented 24% of those killed in 2022, while they only make up 13% of the population. Data shows that Black people are 3 times more likely to be killed by US police than white people. This May, we will mark 75 years of al-Nakba. Also this May, will mark 3 years since the murder of George Floyd, whose memory will forever be linked in the Black Palestinian struggle for freedom and liberation. So why should we care about this solidarity? In recent years, the Black liberation struggle in the US has been intertwined with the Palestinian experience, mainly from the ground up. This bond spans decades and has reached new heights, especially in the context of imperialism, settler colonialism, and racism. How can we heighten our understanding of Black Palestinian solidarity work? And how can we strengthen this bond to ensure our mutual liberation? We have 3 wonderful individuals who will tackle those questions and more. I will give a brief intro and we'll dive right in. We have with us Bill Fletcher Jr., who is the former president of Trans-Africa Forum and a senior scholar with the Institute of Policy Studies. He's the co-author of The Indispensable Ally, Black Workers and the Formation of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, 1934 to 1942, and co-author of Solidarity Divided, The Crisis in Organized Labor and a New Path Towards Social Justice. Mr. Fletcher is a syndicated columnist and a regular media commentator on television, radio, and the web. We also have with us Keith Feldman, who is Associate Professor of Comparative Ethnic Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. He's one of the faculty co-organizers of the Color of New Media, which is a working group sponsored by the Center for Race and Gender and Berkeley Center for New Media that focuses on intersections of critical race theory, gender, and women's studies, and transnational studies with new media studies. He's the author of A Shadow Over Palestine, The Imperial Life of Race in America, which received the 2017 Best Book in Humanities and Cultural Studies from the Association for Asian American Studies. Felicia Eaves is a human rights advocate and activist. She has worked on and within a range of issues and movements, including environmental justice, health equity, and peace, anti-war struggles. Through her work within the peace and anti-war movement, Felicia became active on the issue of Palestinian rights as she became a long-time member and co-chair of the steering committee of the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights. Felicia has been and continues to be committed to ensuring that equity and justice is a viable reality for people of color and other marginalized communities who have been and continue to be beset by centuries of institutional and systemic racial, social, political, and economic injustices, not only in the US, but globally. Felicia was also a former AMP Black-Palestinian Solidarity Coordinator. So thank you all for being with us today. I'm sorry that I had to cut your bios short, but for the sake of time, we want to get to the substantive issues. And Mr. Feldman, I want to start with you. I want you to kind of just frame the issue for us. So if you can just trace the trajectory of the history of Black Palestinian transnational solidarity and explain how that history informs the contours of that solidarity.
Thanks so much, Tarek. And thank you all for being here. It's a real pleasure and honor to join in this really important conversation today. It's a big question, so big that I had to jot down some notes to be able to answer it effectively, or at least begin to answer it effectively. And I want to start by saying the history of Black Palestinian transnational solidarity has been one that a number of scholars in recent years have been really uncovering and unfolding and narrating. I want to gesture to the work of Alex Lubin, Michael Fishback, Hamza Beg, and in particular, there's a recent issue of the Journal of Palestine Studies, edited by Nora Erakat and Mark Lamont Hill, that focuses specifically on Black Palestinian transnational solidarities. It's a really must-read collection of essays, and I'd encourage you to check it out. So the first thing I'd say is that in looking at this history, there's nothing natural or easy about Black Palestinian solidarities. Prior to 1948, you'd be hard-pressed to find an organization or an intellectual that we would think of today as part of the Black radical tradition that paid much mind to the conditions of Palestinian life. The likes of Edward Wilmot Blyden, Marcus Garvey, articulated visions for Black freedom that were inspired explicitly by political Zionism. And views of Palestine and Palestinians in this early 20th century period were often routed through the kind of prevailing Orientalist motifs that were the common sense of the period. Such visions often resonated with positions on the left that viewed Zionist settlement and movements for self-determination as at once socialist and anti-imperialist. Now, the post-World War II and post-1948 moment opened up a kind of a fundamental reordering of struggle against racism, imperialism, and colonialism. And while the Nakba of 1948 marks a fundamental breach in the social and political fabric of Palestine, it really isn't until the 1960s that the Palestine question, leaders and intellectuals. As Hamza Beg shows, throughout the early 1960s, Malcolm X registered concern over the plight of Palestinians, understood as part of a wider anti-colonial struggle. Malcolm X's trips to Cairo and to Gaza in 1964 were absolutely crucial moments of witnessing and political education, even as his views on Palestine, at least in the US context, were at the time largely outliers. Now, 1967 changed matters fundamentally. And here, Black internationalist solidarity with Palestinians flourished, or began to flourish, at least in the wake of the June 67 war. Organizations like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Nation of Islam, and the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense all articulated public commitments to Palestinian freedom and liberation, based in imperialism. They drew taut linkages between domestic struggles against racism and international struggles against imperialism, and utilized their platforms as a way to provide journalistic, scholarly, and firsthand accounts of the conditions of Palestinian life. Now, a critical figure in this history that's not often told is the sociologist David Graham Du Bois, who's the son of Shirley Graham Du Bois and the stepson of W.E.B. Du Bois. Now, David Du Bois worked as a journalist in Cairo from 1960 to 1972. He wrote routinely in the English language newspaper, the Egyptian Gazette, all about the contours of the Black freedom struggle in the US. When Kwame Nkrumah, the leader of the then newly independent Ghana, was overthrown in 1966, Shirley Graham Du Bois, who had been living in Accra at the time and running his office, moved to Cairo. And Shirley Graham Du Bois's own output in the 1960s, 70s is extraordinary, drawing really in critically important links between Pan-Arab and Pan-African movements. Now, by the early 1970s, David Graham Du Bois had moved to Oakland, California, and he had affiliated with the Black Panther Party for self-defense and was assigned the editorial duties of its newspaper. He wrote routinely for the newspaper about the Palestinian experience. And in 1975, when the United Nations passed a resolution condemning Zionism as a form of racism, the newspaper carried numerous articles explaining the resolution, talking about its history, its wider context, and providing a really important analysis. Now, Graham Du Bois also serialized in the newspaper his own novel called And Bid Him Sing. And it's a really fascinating, kind of important and understudied novel of the period that focuses on Pan-Arab and Pan-African political movements. So all of this we might think of as a bit of the texture of internationalism that conjugates the practice of Black Palestinian solidarity. And this is a texture that persists, I think, in really important, if kind of distinct ways today. By the end of the 70s, the political contours, at least in some ways, had shifted. And the conjugation of Black Palestinian solidarity occurred through an engagement largely with questions of US foreign policy. Also connecting to anti-apartheid movement and human rights discourses. And here we find a more kind of avowed engagement with the US state in particular as a potentially productive locus for activism supporting Palestinian freedom. So just to give you a little sense of the texture here, in 1979, the president at the time, Palestinian issue, quote, like the civil rights movement here in the United States. And he didn't elaborate much on this comparison, but he did focus on the ways in which the Palestinian right of return, particularly to the West Bank, was, in his eyes, a kind of a reasonable rights-based issue to consider. Now, Carter was attacked, as you might imagine, and there was great anguish in the popular media over kind of the equating of the Palestinian issue with the civil rights movement. Now, soon thereafter, as historian Michael Fishback recounts, Andrew Young, the highest-ranking African-American federal appointee at the time, who was US ambassador to the United Nations, was forced to step down from his position when it was revealed he'd been in conversation with the PLO's UN representative, Zekti Terzi. Political engagement at the time with the PLO regardless of the substance of that engagement, was in itself deemed inadmissible. Leaders from organizations in the late 70s that in 1967 had completely distanced themselves from the expression of internationalist solidarities with Palestine. After Young had to step down from his position at the UN, many organizations made efforts to open dialogues with Terzi, with members of the PLO, as well as with Arab American groups like the Association of Arab American University Graduates. And in the weeks that followed Young's resignation, folks like Jesse Jackson, Joseph Lowery, Walter Fauntroy, Jack O'Dell, and Huey Newton, among other prominent Black leaders and intellectuals at the time, traveled to Lebanon to meet with Palestinian political representatives and tour the network of long-standing Palestinian refugee camps. In 1980, the Palestine Human Rights Campaign published a lengthy pamphlet based on several of these trips of these delegations. In 1981, the Journal of Palestine Studies devoted an issue to what it called, quote, American Blacks on Palestine. And following the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982 and the massacres at the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps, the vaunted Journal of Black Freedom Struggles, called Freedom Ways, devoted 2 volumes to what it called the Middle East issue. Right? So, like the internationalist strains I discussed earlier, strains of this discourse about human rights, about contesting apartheid, and commitments to Palestinian self-determination still manifest today, again, with potentially different tenors and emphases. And the growth of Arab American organizations in this late 70s and early 80s period, from the ADC and the AAI, informed things like the Democratic Party politics that gave rise to the Rainbow Coalition in the 1980s and culminated in Now today, we are 4 decades on from these moments. And I'd simply want to surface that conditions have changed significantly between then and now. The horizon of possibilities for Palestinian liberation have been reordered in the aftermath of the Oslo Accords and the persistent and ongoing everyday Israeli structures of violence, dispossession, and disavowal that Tarek was registering just a moment ago. Now, meanwhile, in the United States, the last 4 decades have witnessed at once an astronomical expansion of carceral, military, and policing powers, as well as an unprecedented commitment on the part of the US state to Israel, all through the rubric of security. But at the same time, at least in the last couple of decades, we've seen an expansive network of organizations and intellectuals born out of these conditions that see Black and Palestinian futures as kind of a very long, brief history to help begin to contextualize the present.
Wow, thank you so much, Mr. Feldman, for that historical overview. Just a couple of quick questions. One, what was the name of that novel that you just mentioned?
The name of the novel is And Bid Him Sing by David Graham Du Bois.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. And before we move on to our next speaker, I wanted to re-emphasize what Mr. Feldman, what Professor Feldman just said. It is absolutely an essential read, and I have it right here, the Journal of Palestine Studies edition on Black-Palestinian Transnational Solidarity, which is the title of this webinar. Absolutely get yourself a copy of this or get it online, and essential essays. So I definitely second that. Okay, Mr. Fletcher, I want to kind of expand on this conversation a little bit here. So how we refer to Palestine, obviously, or the Zionist project as a settler colonial project. So how does settler colonialism fit into the framework of unconditional support for Israel? And can you address that, as well as the relationship between the Black and the Native American experience relative to the Palestinians?
Well, thank you, Tariq, and assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam.
My greetings to everyone, and my appreciation for being invited. So to your point, let me just start with two overarching points that I want to make, one of which I'll not have time to get into. The first point, which relates to what Dr. Feldman was saying, is that African American support for Palestinians is an outgrowth of a Black internationalism that actually dates back to the 1600s. I'm not saying that the support for Palestinians exists back to the 1600s, but Black internationalism as a current within Black America does. I situated actually at the time of the advent of piracy, which is a whole other discussion. The second point is that the Palestinian context draws parallels with that of the Native Americans and of African Americans, particularly African Americans during the period of Jim Crow segregation in the United States. And once you realize that, it then becomes easier to understand why support for Israel among large sections of the US population resonates. Because fundamentally, they look at the development of Israel as a mini version of the development of the United States. Manifest destiny, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the thing about settler colonialism that's very interesting is that it's always accompanied by myths, and particularly references to God. God almost always intervenes somehow in a settler colonial project, whether you're talking about Northern Ireland, the United States, Australia, South Africa, Israel, or other places. By which I mean the settler population makes the argument that settlement was a gift from God, that God communicated with the settlers and gave the settlers permission to take that land, irrespective of who was there, which goes to the second point, is that in many settler myths, nobody existed in the land when the settlers arrived, even when people actually did exist in the land when people arrived. So whether you're talking about in the United States, in the context of North America, the Native Americans who were here in huge numbers, or if you're looking in South Africa, where it's or Israel, you have this myth that there was no one there. In the case of South Africa, this idea that when the Boers arrived in the 1600s, that that the land was vacant. And so this whole myth, both God and the absence of people, becomes very important. In settler colonialism, there's the racialization of those who are there, which is obviously a contradiction, because if there's no one there, there's no one to racialize. But oops, there are people there, so oops, they're going to be racialized. So there's a racialization of people that are there, and or those who are forcefully brought to the shores. And so again, if you look at in South Africa, the racialization was not just of the people that were there, the indigenous Africans, but also the so-called Cape Malays, the people that were brought from South Asia and Southeast Asia, that were brought to South Africa and were racialized as a population. And certainly we can see that in the case of what came to be known as the United States, after the 13 colonies were formed by the Brits, and the racialization of the indigenous population and the Africans who were brought to these shores, first as indentured servants and slaves, and then by the late 1600s, entirely as slaves. And what's particularly interesting as a side note is that in the early part of the settlement of the 13 colonies, there is no reference to whites. It's in the late 1600s that references to whites emerges. And part of this relates to the entirety of the settler project, not just in North America, but in general, which is that it's not just a project of implanting people where there were people. It's a capitalist project that makes it within which what's central is creating divisions at the base between the settler laboring population and the indigenous laboring population, or in the case of the African importation into North America, those that were forced to come here and forced to labor. So this racialization becomes critically important, and the racialization is not simply or always a matter of skin color. In the case of Northern Ireland, the British, in settling and subjugating Ireland, racialized the indigenous population, despite the fact that, from the standpoint of the outsider, they're all looking the same as what we would call white people. The issue of racialization is the identification of a particular population as being inferior or otherwise as the other, as incompatible with the settler population, or and therefore to be excluded. Racialization included, it wasn't just an ideological, it was also the removal from land, the removal from rights, and also the basic notion that the condition of those, the indigenous or the forced labor that was brought there, that they constituted a mass whose experiences were fundamentally irrelevant, whereas the experiences, the history, the culture of the settlers was themselves relevant. And that relates very much to what we're seeing right now in Israel with the protests against the developing what I call fascization of Israel, where the protesters are demanding democracy and pushing back against an overt fascist direction, but they're doing it in the absence of addressing the Palestinian question, the question of the colonized people of Palestine. And so it becomes a battle within the settler population. And that's not unusual. African Americans, much like blacks in South Africa, experienced profound racial oppression and segregation. In South Africa, it was classified as apartheid, which the United Nations declared violation of human rights in the 60s. In the United States, it was Jim Crow segregation, which apartheid was to a great extent modeled on, as were many of the Nazi laws instituted in the Nuremberg tribunals of 1935. Much like the Palestinians, African Americans were an essential workforce until they weren't. So they were essential in the development of US capitalism, much as the Palestinians were essential in the development of Israeli capitalism, until they are not, until they are replaced or minimized. Settler colonialism presents the settler majority with a very profound problem because it creates a difficulty for the settler in breaking with the settler myth. Because in order to break with the settler myth, you have to challenge one's own identity and one's own conception of what it means to be a human being. And so the settler myth is very, very integrated into how the settler population sees itself, sees whose populations are relevant, whose are not, and part of the anti-colonial project, in the case of Israel, the anti-Zionist project, in other cases, anti-racist and anti-national oppression and anti-imperialist project, is to really shatter the entire notion of the settler colonial state and the settler myth. and that is a matter of not psychology. It becomes a matter of political strategy. And I will leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Oh, no, thank you for that very important context, especially the concept of racialization. And I believe that is sometimes missed in this discourse. Felicia, I want to end with you here. So, how would you expound? How would you elaborate on the intersectional parallels that exist today between Black people in America and Palestinians in Palestine? And how do you think that impacts political support in the present for the Palestinian cause? I think you're on mute, Felicia. If I'm not mistaken, I think you're on mute. There you go.
Can you hear me now? Okay. Can you hear me now?
Do you want me to repeat the question, or you got it?
I got it. Thank you so much for asking me back. 2 years ago, or it's been 2 years, almost 2.5 years ago now. I had the privilege of doing a series of talks that Bill was a part of, that talked about transnational solidarity with Blacks and Palestinians. So I'm so happy to be back to kind of expound on this myself. But you mentioned in your opening that, we're 3 years out from George Floyd. We're 10 years out from, almost 10 years out from Ferguson. And so, I think where we're at, and it's interesting that Bill was talking about, our plight from slavery to up till now. I think we're at what Dr. Peniel E. Josephs talks about in his book, The Third Reconstruction of America. But I would expound upon that and say that that third reconstruction is more of a global reconstruction. Because as we're seeing the kinds of things that have been happening here in the United States with police brutality, those things have been paralleled in Palestine, and actually they've been not only parallel, but they've been happening at the very same time. I mean, at the same time that Ferguson was happening, there was another sort of uprisal in Palestine. And so we continue to see these things, but I think what has happened is that we've lost a sense. Bill talked about Black people being more internationalist, and I think we have lost a sense of that internationality in our work. One of the speeches that Dr. King spoke, that's one of my favorites, is the one where he was at the Riverside Church, the one where he talks about Vietnam. And for me, that was a pivotal place in the civil rights movement, particularly for Dr. King, but I think for the civil rights movement, where the civil rights movement transcended from being civil rights to a humanitarian movement, even though many of Dr. King's colleagues didn't go along with him on that until a little bit later, until after he was killed. But I think that's where we are right now, that we need to bring the civil rights movement into more of a humanitarian movement. And I think that's where the intersectionality of what's happening in Palestine could be a linchpin to that. One of the things I think could help with that is maybe a reframing of how we've framed Palestine in terms of the military aid that the United States has given over the years. In 2019, we gave another $3.8 billion, and all but 0.2% of that went to the military. So with that, we're looking at trying to figure out how to bring Black Americans along with that in saying that, okay, if we are complicit, our dollars, our tax dollars are going towards not only the militarization and of here in the United States, but we are complicit in the oppression and the deaths of people in Palestine. So, and that money could be going back to things that we need here in the United States and in Black communities, because as we know, there's a saying that says that when white people get the flu, Black people get pneumonia, which means that the disparities in the Black communities are so profound that, we often are way above what most people have in other communities. And so one of the things that I was thinking about, that how we could reframe that is more of a capitalistic economic way, and saying that, we could bring those dollars by decoupling ourselves from Israel in terms of the aid that we give, the military aid that we give to Israel. Those dollars could come back to the Black community. And I think that would be a way in which we could get more Black people to sign on to this. I also think that there is a need for us as Black liberation activists, as well as Palestinian and Palestinian American activists, to become more intentional in our work in terms of coming together and being more in coalition with each other. I think if that happened, I was just thinking about what happened with Representative Ilhan Omar, in terms of her being kicked off the Foreign Affairs Committee, and how the Congressional Black Caucus sort of handled that. Now, we know that, there is pressure in Congress, and has always been pressure amongst the Congressional Black Caucus to not really side against, the White House administration on Israel. But I think if we had a stronger coalition amongst Black liberation activists and Palestinian American activists, I think we could use that momentum to say to the Black Caucus, members of the Black Caucus, as well as members of the Progressive Caucus, that it's time for you all to stop being so scared of what you believe might happen. I mean, we've been through a pandemic, we've been through Trump. I mean, what else is there to be scared of? Most of them, kept their seats. So I believe it's time that, because I was really upset at how the Black Caucus handled Representative Omar. I mean, on one hand, they said, well, she shouldn't have been kicked off of the Foreign Affairs Committee. But on the other hand, they didn't address why the GOP kicked her off the Foreign Affairs Committee. And that's, we're at a time now where we can no longer sit by, and particularly as she is a Black woman sitting, and a member of the Black Caucus, for them to not, to kind of backhand in a way, not support her fully, to me was very upsetting. So I think it's now time, it's 2023. We have gone a long way in terms of the discourse. And I think now it's time for us to push and bring a little bit more momentum up to our members of Congress to say, it's now time for you all to take a real stand against the apartheid project in Israel, and, decouple ourselves from that so that we can have a more just relationship there. And one of the things that I've been thinking about is that perhaps it's time for us to have a summit where we intentionally have Black liberation activists and Palestinian American activists come together so that we can intentionally strategize. I mean, it's nice to have people like I think during one of the advocacy days the AMP had 2 years ago, we had Hillary Shelton, who is a member of the NAACP Washington Bureau, speak. And that's wonderful. And it was good to see him. But we've kind of done this type of thing a little bit haphazardly. And so I would propose that as we move towards the general election in 2024, that perhaps we need to come together as a group, not only in solidarity of each other, but come together to talk about how do we once and for all make this a priority for us, because I could even see this as being part of a reparations package that Black people say, okay, if part of our reparations package is going to be in dollars or in a monetary type of settlement in that way, one of the demands that we would make is that the U.S. divest from Israel. And I mean, I know that's a bold thing to say or to make a demand of, but we speak a lot about, if nobody's free unless everybody's free. Well, we need to really put that into action and say that, we cannot take money from the United States and then those dollars are going back towards the oppression of other people. So those are just my thoughts. And I'm, like I said, I'm very happy to have to be a part of this discussion. I'm looking forward to questions and seeing how this all turns out. Thank you so much.
Wow. I'm glad that this is recorded so I can go back to this and try to educate myself on what you three just gave our audience, just a lot of rich information. And, when we think of the present, we think of from Ferguson until now as kind of like the proper departure point. And, this obviously spans much, much longer than that. And it's just got heightened, I would say, in 2014. There was an example that did cause an uproar, and it was on Martin Luther King's birthday. I believe it was 4 years ago, a year before COVID, 2019. Michelle Alexander put out an article titled "Time to Break the Silence" or "Time." Yeah, I believe it's "Time to Break the Silence," and this was in honor of Dr. King's legacy, and pretty much the essence of the article is it's time to speak up. If we're going to honor King's message and not just the individual, we must condemn what Israel is doing. And she went on to highlight various crimes that Israel is committing and U.S. complicity in them. So those who, and of course this caused the ruckus, caused the backlash. And those who oppose Black-Palestinian solidarity or try to diminish it or say that it's some kind of phony concept or misunderstand its historical underpinnings, continue to dismiss the transnational character involved. And they treat it as some theoretical concept that's not rooted in fact in history. And obviously, just from the 40 minutes that the three of you spoke, that's obviously not true. So the more we align our struggles, the more vitriol comes our way. Can anybody speak to why you think that is? Well, the more organized we become, the more cohesive we become, the more together we are, the more vitriol comes our way. Mr. Fletcher, looks like you wanted to jump in. Go right ahead.
I think you cannot get away from the fact that Israel is a primarily European settler colony with leaders who speak English in many cases as if they came from New York or Boston or Philadelphia or Chicago. And they represent, for many people in the United States, simply, as I was trying to raise earlier, a continuation of manifest destiny. That what was done in Israel was done by a legitimate population against an unruly, hard to understand population that was there, that was primitive, was in the way of progress, etc. All of that becomes very central to the way that the conflict ends up being viewed. So those of us that say that's not the way to look at it, when we're challenging this, then of course we come under attack. And that's why our struggle really needs to be about undermining the entirety of the settler colonial myth, the entirety of the Zionist project. It's not about going against Jews. In fact, I would argue that this is a moment when fighting anti-Semitism has become even more urgent because of the rise of the far right and what it's doing, and by this really unholy alliance between the Zionist project and Christian Zionists and white Christian nationalists, that now is the time to identify who are the real anti-Semites and really concentrate on that. So I think it's a combination of those things, Tarek, that result in this the vitriol that's aimed at us.
Yeah, I just echo and underscore a couple things. Tarek, I so appreciate that you brought up, Michelle Alexander's really important op-ed in the New York Times. I think it was one of her last that she was invited to publish with the New York Times. And I went back, in preparation for today and was going through these old issues of Freedom Ways from the late 70s and early 80s. And Jack O'Dell's opening essay in this, 1983 issue of Freedom Ways is titled Breaking the Silence. And thing in many respects that Alexander said in 2019, that especially in the aftermath of the Sabra and Shatila massacres, it is high time for folks in the United States to join actually many other people around the world in condemning these massacres and standing on the side of Palestinians and Palestinian rights. The other thing I'd say that's actually interesting in looking back to this kind of late 70s and early 80s moment, to pick up on something Felicia was noting, is that the argument around U.S. state support for Israel and the outsized support for Israel from the U.S. state that we see is also there. It's there in the late 70s and early 80s. If you look at the work of really remarkable African-American poet and activist June Jordan, when she writes about Palestine and Palestinians in the early 1980s, part of her argument around why folks in the United States should care is because our tax dollars are underwriting and dispossession and violence. And so as we think, and I think I'd echo Felicia in the sort of the critical importance and pushing on a reconceptualization of where resources go, right? As we think about that, there are long strains of precedent, that we can draw on in terms of how arguments and the organizing that goes around them get made.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I would have been remiss if I did not mention Michelle Alexander's wonderful piece that I thought caused the right kind of ruckus. Felicia, I want to talk about that, just specifically regarding that period that re-emphasized or heightened Black-Palestinian transnational solidarity, and that's of course in the summer of 2014. The police killing of Michael Brown by Darren Wilson and its subsequent uprisings, especially in Ferguson, Missouri, coincided with Israel's 50-day aggression in Gaza, the worst aggression committed in Gaza since I would say since 2005. Mm-hmm. And how do these two examples reinforce the dehumanization, devaluation, and degradation of both Black and Palestinian life?
Well, I think one of the things that, we have come to understand is that in the complicitness of the United States supporting Israel, there has been an importation of Israeli police tactics in the United States police force. So how we tend to police is very much like how policing happens in Israel. And as a matter of fact, we know and have evidence that the Israeli government has invited police chiefs around the country and police forces around the country to come and observe and take away knowledge about how they, police in Israel, and police chiefs and police forces in the United States have taken those tactics back. And so what we saw with Michael Brown and George Floyd was kind of an importation of what Palestinians have endured through the military policing that they endure every day in Israel and Palestine. And those tactics were brought back here in the United States, and we're still seeing those same types of tactics being done. And so I think that's where, again, the intersection of how Black Americans and people of color here in the United States are treated by police forces and state-sanctioned violence by way of policing happens, and that, that's the kind of unfortunately, that's the commonality of the dehumanization that happens. And so these are the things that I think that particularly Black Americans, many Black Americans don't know and don't understand. And so these are the things that I think need to be brought out more intentionally for us to understand that, as I say, what happens over there often comes back to haunt us and happens over here. And so we should not get so consumed with what's happening here to the point that we don't understand that we are in a global situation. I mean, racism, systemic racism and systemic discrimination is a global thing. And so, what's happening to Palestinians, and as you said, that was, I mean, that I remember that time because I was doing a lot of work in terms of Palestine, but also feeling guilty that I wasn't doing enough work in terms of what was going on with Ferguson. So I was feeling conflicted about what was happening during that time. But I think, those are the kinds of details that many African Americans don't know. And I think if they were more educated about that, and then understanding that our tax dollars are going towards that type of brutality, I think that is something that would help to bring to bring the two movements together, and to also say, and would also give us a platform to say to Congress that, you're not going to use my tax dollars to our tax dollars are already going to, towards state sanctioned violence here in the United States with the type of policing and police brutality that we're seeing here. So you're not going to use my tax dollars to do that in somebody else's country, And, going back to what Bill said about, the whole thing about God, I mean, Palestine is where Jesus was born. I mean, would people want to have that? I think that's, especially with Black folks, that's something that I think we could really expound upon in terms of, this is happening in the Holy Land, what's supposed to be called the Holy Land. And I mean, there are a lot of unholy acts that have been happening in the Holy Land for, many, many years. And so just kind of reframing that to kind of help, in a way that would resonate with Black people, I think would help in terms of building those bridges and helping other Black Americans understand that our lives are very intertwined in ways that many of us don't understand here in the United States.
No, that is absolutely correct, Felicia. And I just want to add to that, our tax dollars are not only going to what is happening over there. One common theme shared between the U.S. and Israel is the exchange of tactics and expertise in state violence, which has been ongoing for 2 decades. JVP put out a report called The Deadly Exchange that really details this. And I believe that's something that the audience should definitely read more about. I want to conclude with this question from an analytical framework, Mr. Fletcher. Critiquing Israeli policy and Zionism is not at all foreign to the Black tradition of condemning injustice. I mean, it's conceptually one and the same. Can you speak to that kind of critique?
Yeah. The Black internationalist tradition really coheres in the 1800s around both abolition, but also, interestingly enough, in the 1840s, 1850s, in what was called the Negro Convention movements, there were declarations in solidarity with Ireland, and which is really quite remarkable when you think about it. You'd expect the condemnations of slavery, the slave trade, etc., but the identification with the Irish freedom struggle and calling for the liberation of Ireland was a remarkable turn, and it represented something that we start to see from then on, of a segment of Black America seeing itself in solidarity with struggles of other oppressed peoples, particularly those subjected to racist and national oppression and occupation, colonization, etc. And then on time, other forms of oppression. So our approach towards the freedom for Palestine, for Palestinians, is a direct line from the Negro Convention movements, a direct line from the internationalization of the abolitionist movement.
Wow, I can't believe it's been 1 hour already. I knew this should have been a 2-part series, just because I have so many questions that I've prepared here to to ask you guys. But thank you so much for being a part of this webinar. I want to just conclude here as a reminder, we are just 3 weeks away from the holiest time of the year, the sacred month of Ramadan. We are reaching out to you to remind you to boycott Israeli dates during this blessed time. There is nothing that could be more contradictory to the principles of fasting than to break our fasts with the dates of our oppressor. So to consume Israeli dates is to enable the theft of our blessed land and to subsidize the dispossession of our Palestinian brothers and sisters living there. So please join our campaign and learn about what you can do at ampalestine.org. Again, that's ampalestine.org. We are officially done with this webinar. I want to thank our esteemed panel, Felicia Eaves, Bill Fletcher Jr., and Keith Feldman. Thank you all so much for your insight and for the knowledge that you've given me and our audience. Thank you so much.